Before we dive in, drop a quick hi in the comments. It may seem small, but trust me, it really helps YouTube share this story with more sci-fi fans like us. I'd love to see who's watching.
The prison answered. The pour was still cooling in the guard station below when the corridor behind them filled with Sarek. Marshall counted them in the half-second before the blast door ground shut. 8, maybe 10. Weapons up, advancing in the tight wedge of the hunt and seal order. The same order that had opened the forge now threatened to seal it again. The crew had a sealed hull at their backs, scavenged Sarek weapons in their hands, and a foundry alarm shrieking through the prison loud enough to rattle their teeth. "Back," Marshall said. "Through the cast room. Move." They moved. Bran went last, because Bran was the one who could afford to. A weapon bolt caught him high in the shoulder, and the Netherium beneath his skin absorbed the bolt and flung the energy sideways in a spray of sparks, leaving the flesh beneath untouched. He grunted, more surprise than pain, and reached back with the black hand and closed it on a wall conduit and tore the whole length of it free. He swung it through the first two Sarek, coming through the door the way a man clears brush, and they went down folded wrong, and he backed into the cast room after the others, with the conduit dragging sparks behind him. Varuna went the other way. The aquatic alien moved with a slow, enormous certainty that had nothing to do with speed. He filled half the corridor in his pressurized tank suit, water sloshing gray behind a faceplate, cracked and resealed a dozen times over the years, and he caught a Sarek that had slipped wide to flank Bran and simply folded it against the wall with two heavy forelimbs. He held it there. He did not rush. He kept it pinned while it hammered at the suit and found nothing it could damage. The blows grew weaker. Then they stopped altogether. Only after the body went limp did he let it slide down the wall and turn his huge head toward Bran. A sound came out of the suit's external speaker, low and bubbling and patient, run through whatever translator the Sarek had bolted to his tank decades ago. "Long time," Varuna said, "since one of them bled where I could watch." "There's plenty more where that came from," Bran said. "Good." The water shifted behind the faceplate, something that might have been satisfaction. "Save me some." Hask hit the rest of the Sarek line like a slope giving way. 6 limbs, a torn rack strut gripped in 2 of them, and the laborer drove into them with the flat indifference of a thing that had hauled loads heavier than a grown man every day of a life, measured only by what it could carry. A bolt scored across his broad back and burned a black line through the hide, and he didn't slow for it. He didn't seem to notice it. He took the strut through the last standing guard and stood there in the wreckage, breathing hard, 6 limbs splayed. Then he looked back at the humans almost shyly, as though waiting to be told he'd done it right. Then it was quiet, or as quiet as the alarm let it be, and it was only the 8 of them, 4 humans, the giant, the laborer, and 2 soft-shelled prisoners pressed flat against the cast room wall, alone in a prison that now knew exactly where they were and exactly what they'd done to it. Jace wiped grease and somebody's blood off the door panel and got it sealed behind them. "They'll wall the whole sector now," he said. "That's the move. Trap us in the bottom, cut the power, cut the air, starve it out slow. They don't even have to come in after us. They just have to wait." "Then waiting's their mistake," Marshall said. He looked around the cast room, at the dead Sarek, at the cooling channels, at the 7 living things still on their feet. "We sit down here, and they grind us out in a day. Quiet. Nobody up top ever knows it happened." He shook his head. "Or we open every door in this place and hand them 10,000 problems instead of 7. Collins was already nodding. Slow. "They won't move on their own. I told you that. Every one of them did the same math we did at the market every day for years, till there was nothing under it but the math." He looked toward the sealed door, toward the dark of the lower blocks beyond it. "But they'll move if you show them it can be done. They have to see it. With their own eyes." Then we show them, Marshall said, loud enough that the whole bottom of this prison sees it at once. They started with one. Jace cracked the holding block that backed onto the cast room. A long, low gallery packed with the spent stock. The broken ones, hundreds of them behind a single control door. He opened in 11 seconds flat with a dead guard slate and a string of Sauric code he'd been quietly memorizing since his first day on the cleaning detail. The door rolled back on its track. The prisoners inside looked through the gap at the humans standing there, then at the 2 dead Sauric cooling on the floor. And they didn't move. They'd been taught not to, and the teaching had taken. Years of tones and marks and walks down the bright hall had pressed it into them past the place where courage lives. Marshall didn't try a speech. He didn't have one, and he wouldn't have trusted his own mouth with it if he had. He walked into the block instead, bent, picked up a fallen Sauric weapon off the floor, and held it out. Not to the crowd, which would have meant nothing, but to one of them. A lean, scarred prisoner near the front, some upright reptile thing whose eyes had followed the weapon from the second the door opened and hadn't left it since. "You already know how they bleed," Marshall said. "You've been smelling it your whole time in here. You want to make some of it yourself?" The prisoner looked at the weapon, looked past it at the 2 dead guards, looked, longest of all, at the open door behind the humans. Open, actually rolled back and standing open. The one thing none of them in that block had seen in years and had stopped letting themselves want. It took the weapon out of Marshall's hand. That was the crack. One scarred grip closing around one Sauric rifle, and the whole block seemed to breathe out at once and then breathe in something new. 10 more surged for the dead guard's gear, then 30. The held breath stillness that had ruled the place broke apart into noise and motion, prisoners pulling weapons and restraints and anything that could be swung, the dam not bursting but cracking wide and letting through a flood that had been building behind it for a very long time. But not all of them came. That was the part Collins watched. A whole corner of the block stayed pressed to the back wall and did not move toward the open door. An older prisoner held that corner, an aging 4-armed thing with 2 younger ones tucked behind the span of its arms, and it watched the others arming themselves with naked dread on its face. When Collins caught its eye across the block, it shook its head. Slow, certain, final. It had seen reprisal. It had been here long enough to have watched a sector resist once before, and to have seen, afterward, what Kairos 9 did to a sector that resisted. It wanted no part of standing on the floor with a weapon in its hands when the Sauric came back through that door, and it believed, with the full weight of everything it had survived, that the Sauric would come back. Collins held the look a moment longer. Then he nodded, once, and let it go. "Leave them," Marshall said, low at his shoulder. "Everybody here gets to choose. That's the whole point of opening the door. They chose." "I know." But Collins looked back once more at the 2 young ones behind the old one's arms before following the others. The rest of the block poured out past them into the hall, armed and shouting and decades overdue, and the rising stopped. Being 4 pirates and a handful of allies, and became, for the first time, a thing with its own weight and its own momentum. They went up through the lower sectors after that like water, finding every crack in a wall. Jace ran the doors, reading the colored bands off the corridor signage, and the bands told a different story now that they were inside the machine instead of being fed through it. Halfway up, they passed a wing in clinical white, the same white as the theater glass Marshall had stood behind in the dark, watching them measure how long it took a thing to stop, and the doors along it carried the bright band Jace had marked his very first day. He didn't need to crack the rest of the script to read what stood behind the glass. The air smelled of antiseptic, hot alloy, and the sweet chemical tang of preservation fluid. Tanks. Long rows of them, lit from beneath. Subjects suspended mid-process in fluid, a dozen species and more, several of them caught half-finished, dark alloy grafted where a limb had been cut away, plating fused to scaled hide, the whole brutal procedure abandoned in place when the alarms pulled the technicians out at a run. A results board filled the far wall, columns of Sauric figures stacked under specimen tags, the cold accounting of 100 captured species rendered down into compatibility scores and rejection rates and times to death. Colin stopped in front of the glass for 1 second too long. "That's what they were doing to all of them," Colin said. "Not just Bran. Every door in this place. Every species." "And we're the only line on that board that held," Bran said. He turned the black hand over and looked at it in the white light. "Everything else up there rejected and died. That's why they want me breathing. I'm the only result they've got that worked." Marshall looked once at the wall of specimen numbers. "You're the prize," he said quietly. "No wonder the whole prison came after you." Bran let the hand drop. "So when this is over, that board burns with the rest of it." "Let's keep moving so there isn't over," Marshall said, pulling them on. "The sector armory's 2 halls up. Jace had it on the map. We take that. We stop fighting with dead men's scraps and start fighting with theirs." The armory was where luck ended. A squad held the control point in front of it, dug in behind hard cover, and these did not break the way the floor guards had broken. These were soldiers, not orderlies, drilled, disciplined, unbothered by the screaming and the smoke, and they put down a dozen prisoners in the open approach before the rebels closed half the distance. The freed stock had courage now, and almost no idea how to use it, and they paid the full price for that. Body after body in the corridor. One of the 2 soft-shelled prisoners who'd been with the crew since the transport went down fell in the open and did not get back up. There was no time to do anything about it, but step past. It was Varuna who broke the line. The old aquatic walked out into the open and into the full weight of the Sauric fire, bolts cracking and skating off the tank suit, scoring the metal, starring the faceplate. And he didn't stop. He drew every gun in the squad onto himself by the simple fact of being too big and too slow to ignore. And while they emptied themselves into him, the humans went wide along both walls. He reached the control point with his suit smoking and brought his entire enormous weight straight down onto it. The impact opened a gap, and Hask came through low and fast, and between the giant who would not fall and the laborer who would not stop, the squad was finished in under a minute. Then the armory was theirs. Racks of real Sauric weapons, charge cells, breaching gear, the whole arsenal of the lower prison passing hand to hand into the grip of the Rising. After that, it went the way Collins had always said it would once they believed. Sector by sector, door by door, the freed prisoners spread through the lower half of the facility, and by the time the Sauric pulled back hard and slammed the upper level sealed, the entire bottom of Kairos 9 belonged to the rebellion. A real foothold, taken by their own hands, paid for. Varuna stood in the captured armory with gray water bubbling slow behind his ruined faceplate, and looked at the racks of weapons, and the open doors, and the prisoners moving free through halls that had held them like stock an hour before. "I waited a long time for this," he said. "Longer than the 4 of you have been alive, I'd wager. Long enough I stopped marking it." He lifted a Sauric rifle in one heavy forelimb, as though testing the weight of the whole moment. Turns out it was worth the wait. Hask laughed, a wet, broken, delighted sound from somewhere deep in the 6-limbed chest, and clapped a limb against the giant's suit, leaving a bloody print across the metal, and the 2 of them stood there, grinning in the wreckage as though it meant something. It did. High above them, in his gallery, Duke Zoran Valis had stopped watching the sorting floors. He stood in front of a schematic of his own facility instead, and a full third of it had gone red, and the red was climbing. "It's contained," Sethric said, fast. Only the lower sectors are compromised, Your Grace. The upper levels are sealed. The forge controls are behind hard doors. They have nowhere left, too. They hold the lower armory. Baron Korath had come uninvited again, and the tilt of his long head carried something far sharper than the pleasure he'd worn before. They have real weapons now, Sethric. Ordnance. The stock you personally assured His Grace was broken beyond use is holding an entire third of his world at gunpoint. He let that settle. And how is your concealed anomaly, the unlabeled one, the human that began all of this? Sethric said nothing. The blade he had held so carefully by its edge in the early days was buried to the grip in his own foot now, and every noble in the room could see it. Duke Valis did not enter the squabble. He stood very still and did the harder work of recalculating 40 years of certainty in the space of a breath. The houses would turn on each other soon enough, for tonight they would fall into line, because a duke at war was still a duke. This is not a containment problem, he said, and the room went quiet around him. Containment is what one does to stock. Stock does not seize an armory. Stock does not coordinate, or hold ground, or choose its targets. He turned from the schematic. What is below us is a war. We will have the decency to call it that, and to fight it as one. His gaze moved to Korath, then to Sethric, unhurried, and made plain that he had weighed exactly what each of their ambitions had cost him tonight. Seal the forge controls, reinforce every command level, strip the outer wings, pull the guards in, and hold the upper prison like the fortress it was built to be. A pause. And the human carrying the Netherium is to be taken alive, whatever else burns. Everything else on this world is now expendable. That one is not. Far out, in the cold dark behind the outer moon, the Directorate cutter held its silent watch. The message it had folded into the void had already reached human space. General William Joseph read it twice. It was thin, and that was the worst of it. Carter was not a man given to speculation. He was methodical, intelligent, and stubborn enough to stay with a problem long after anyone else would have written it off. If he put something in a report, it was because he'd exhausted every other explanation first, which, here, amounted to almost nothing. An uncharted system passed the Veil line, a facility of industrial scale on a world that appeared on no chart. Transports arriving full of sentience of many species and departing empty. A heat bloom deep in the structure and a spike of alien alarm traffic that suggested, in Carter's deliberately cautious phrasing, that something inside had begun to fight. And one unconfirmed possibility hung on a single abandoned freighter sitting on the surface, that there were humans down there somewhere in the dark. That was the whole of it. No numbers, no layout, no count of the enemy, no map of the ground, no eyes inside the walls. A sealed black box beyond the edge of every chart the Directorate held, with screaming leaking out of the seams. Joseph set the message down on the desk. A few days ago, this had been a cargo theft, 16 crates of stolen processors, and a pirate crew not worth the fuel to chase. Now it was a few words he found he could not unread, sitting at the bottom of Carter's careful report. They do not return them. Attached to a place no human had been meant to find, and apparently could not now afford to ignore. Wake the 9th, he said. Full deployment. Combat readiness. All elements. Sir. Joseph was already on his feet and moving. Carter went in blind and chose to stay. We can manage the same. He stopped at the threshold. If there are people of ours inside that place, then we are already late, and every hour we spend looking for better maps makes us later. Move. Yes, sir. The order went out down the line. Across the docks, the 9th began to wake, engines flaring to life one after another in the dark. Far ahead of them, beyond the veil, and beyond every chart, A prison burned from the bottom up, while the men coming to save it knew almost nothing about what they were flying into. They tried the front door first because they had to know. Marshall sent the push up the main spine of the prison an hour after the lower sectors went quiet. 100 armed prisoners, the best of the freed stock, formed the column. Hask and the upright reptile thing from the holding block led the way, with the crew spread through the middle. They moved fast, and they moved confident, because confidence was what the lower prison had taught them in a single afternoon, and they carried that confidence straight into the teeth of what the Sorek had built up top. It did not go the way the lower sectors had gone. The first sealed checkpoint opened the moment they reached it, not because Jace cracked it, but because the Sorek wanted it open. The corridor beyond was a kill box, long and straight and bare, and the guards holding the far end were not orderlies with stun poles. They were soldiers behind hard cover with crew-served weapons, and they let the first rank of prisoners get 40 meters in before they fired. The front of the column came apart. The reptile thing that had taken the first weapon from Marshall's hand in the holding block went down in the opening volley and did not get up, and a dozen more went down around it, and the corridor that had looked like a door turned out to be a trap with the Sorek patience behind it. Hask dragged 2 wounded prisoners back by their collars with his rear limbs, while the rest of them broke and ran, and the checkpoint sealed again behind the retreat, and the spine of the prison was exactly as Sorek as it had been that morning. They regrouped 2 sectors down, in the captured armory, and counted what the front door had cost. 18, Collins said. 18 dead for a road we can't use. Then we stopped trying to use it, Marshall said. He was looking at Jace's grease map, redrawn larger now on the armory wall. We don't have the bodies to walk up that spine. Every checkpoint up there is a kill box, and they've got the high ground and the hard guns. We push that way. We feed them the whole rebellion a corridor at a time, and they thank us for it. He set his palm flat on the lower levels, the red of them, the part they held. So we don't push that way. There's no other way up, one of the freed prisoners said. There's never been another way up. The spine is the only route to the command levels. Everyone knows that. Everyone who got told that by the people who built the place. Marshall looked at Jace. I don't want the route they show prisoners. I want the route they use themselves. Find me their doors. Jace was already pulling a Sorek slate out of his jacket. A good one, an officer's, pried off the dead squad leader at the armory. Give me a few hours with this, he said. If there's another way through this prison, I'll find it. Until then, stay off the spine. Jace found the doors. He found a great deal more than the doors. He spent 3 hours in a maintenance alcove with the officer's slate and 3 dead guards' access tokens, and the slow, patient work that was the only kind of fighting he was truly built for. He discovered that the Sorek network was not one network. Kairos 9 ran on a dozen overlapping systems, one for each Noble's sector, and they did not talk to each other. They were not designed to talk to each other. Each house kept its own access, its own supply manifests, its own security overrides, walled off from the others, not against the prisoners, who were never supposed to touch a slate, but against each other. They've got no shared security, Jace said, when he pulled the crew in close to show them. None. Sethrik's sector can't see into Korath's. Korath's can't override Sethrik's. They built it that way on purpose so neither one could steal the other's work. He tapped through 3 layers of a manifest. Which means there's no master lockdown. There's no single key. Every sector's a separate fortress with a separate door, and the gaps between those fortresses. He pulled up a service map, a spider's web of maintenance routes nobody had bothered to wall because no house owned them. The gaps are unguarded. Nobody secured the seams because nobody could agree whose job it was. So you can get us up through the seams, Marshall said. I can get us up through the seams, he confirmed. It was while he was mapping those seams that he found the archive. It was Sethrik's, buried in the research sector's own walled system, the part Sethrik had hidden so thoroughly from Korath that he'd hidden it from his own Duke's oversight, too. Jace went into it sideways, through a maintenance handshake that was never meant to carry data, and what came back stopped him for a moment in the dark of the alcove. It was a directory, a long one, facility designations, each with a number, each with a status line. Kairos 9 was one entry on a list, and the list ran down past the edge of the slate's first screen. The oldest dates were centuries old. Project Ascension was not one prison's work. It was a Sauric institution, funded by houses that smiled across the same tables and sharpened knives under them. Valis had his world. Koreth had his sector. Sethric had money, contacts, and enough private machinery to make nobles treat him like one of their own. They all fed the same ambition, an obedient army carrying Netherium in its bones, soldiers strong enough to carry Sauric rule beyond the worlds they already owned. But the cooperation was a lie. Every house wanted the breakthrough first. Whoever controlled Ascension would not just win favor. They would rise over the others, over the Count's house itself, and make the rest of the Sauric kneel. And there was a flag on the human line. Recent. Priority. A short string of Sauric notation that Jace had learned well enough by now to read, and it said, in the cold shorthand of the research that had taken Bran's arm, full compatibility, no rejection. First recorded. Escalate to house priority. Bran, Jace said quietly. He showed him the line. It's not just that you didn't die. You're the first thing on a list centuries long that held. Every species they've ever run rejected the alloy except us. He let that sit. That's the flag. That's why Valis won't trade you for anything. Humanity isn't just another result to them. We're the result. The one they've been looking for. Bran looked at the line a long moment, his black hand resting on the slate's edge. Then they're going to want a lot more of us, he said. Not just me. All of us. Humanity. His eyes stayed on the slate. We're not the end of that list. We're the key to making the rest of it work. He closed the dark hand. We don't just break this place. We make sure that list never gets to the next name. One world at a time, Marshall said. This one first. Jace, find us a way up. 3 hours of Jace's work meant they moved as ghosts. The maintenance routes between the houses' sectors were dark and unwatched, and the crew went up through them in small teams, while the freed prisoners made noise on the spine. Not an assault this time. A feint, enough fire and shouting at the kill box checkpoints to keep the Sauric soldiers facing down, while the real strike climbed up behind their own walls. And as they climbed, they used the thing Jace had handed them, which was better than any weapon in the captured armory. They used the houses against each other. Jace, riding Sethric's own walled system from the inside, redirected an automated supply train, a heavy automated hauler loaded with charge cells and reactor coolant, bound for Koreth's sector, and rerouted it through a junction logged under Sethric's authority. When Koreth's people found their supplies gone, the record showed Sethric's hand on the diversion, plain as a signature, because it had been Sethric's system that moved it. It was not sabotage the humans had invented. It was a theft Koreth already half believed Sethric capable of, because Sethric had been hiding things from him for weeks, and the moment the evidence appeared, it confirmed everything the Baron already suspected. That was the whole art of it. Jace didn't manufacture the hatred. He just handed it proof. Koreth's sector locked its doors against Sethric's. 2 houses that should have been holding one wall against the Rising turned and put half their guns on each other instead, each certain the other was looting them while the prison burned. Koreth stripped the relay to reinforce the boundaries of his sector. Certain Sethric's people were already moving against him. And in the seam between those 2 suddenly hostile fortresses, where the guards had been pulled to face inward at a rival instead of downward at the prisoners, the crew came up out of the maintenance dark and took a command relay that had been held by 40 Sauric that morning, and was held by only 12 by the time they reached it. The 12 Sauric fought hard. Hask took a bolt through one of his lower limbs and kept moving on the other 5. Varuna walked the front again, drawing the guns, his tank suit starred and smoking, and the relay fell, and the rebels stood inside a command node 2 levels above where any prisoner of Kairos 9 had ever stood and lived. It was a war fought with a stolen manifest and a maintenance map, and it worked because the Sarek had built their own house with no shared roof. Duke Zeran Valis understood what was happening to him before either of his subordinates did. He stood in his high command with the schematic in front of him, and he watched Koreth's sector and Sethrik's sector light up red along the border they shared. Not the red of the Rising, the red of 2 of his own houses firing on each other, and he did not waste a moment's anger on it. Anger was for nobles, who thought the universe owed them a fair fight. Valis had presided over Kairos 9 for 40 years, precisely because he had never once believed that. "They've turned us against ourselves," he said. The aide beside him went still. The prisoners, the clever one in their network. He found the seams and turned the Sorek houses against one another. And now, Baron Koreth and Sethrik are spending their guns on a grudge, while the stock walks up through the gap between them. He watched the relay node go red, taken, lost, his, and felt the shape of the defeat forming, and did not flinch from it. "This world is going to fall." The aide started to protest. Valis lifted a hand, and the protest died. "Not today. Not this hour. But it is going to fall, and a duke who cannot see that coming is a duke who dies in his own command, waiting for reinforcements that his rivals will make certain never arrive." He turned from the schematic. "Which means the question is no longer how I hold Kairos 9. The question is what I take with me when it is gone." He gave the orders quietly, and he gave them only to the aides from the smaller houses sworn to his own, the ones Koreth and Sethrik could not hear. A ship, not the garrison fleet, but his own house courier, the fast vessel he reserved for private travel when a duke preferred not to arrive with an escort. The research corps, not the whole archive, only the human line, the centuries-long list, and the one flag at the bottom of it that made the whole institution worth continuing. The compatibility data, the blueprint, everything that mattered about why a human arm and a human leg had accepted untested Netherium and lived when 10,000 others had rotted off the bone. He did not announce it. He did not tell Koreth or Sethrik, who were still firing on each other's sectors, and would keep firing, usefully, drawing the rebellion's eye while he prepared. He simply began in the calm, methodical way of a creature that had decided to lose a battle in order to keep a war, to pack the only cargo that had ever been the point. The prison would burn. Valis intended to be somewhere else, with the future in his hold, when it did. In the captured relay node, in the lull while Jace mapped the next seam upward, Varuna sat down for the first time anyone could remember. The tank suit wasn't built for sitting. He folded into a corner anyway, the water inside him settling, and he watched the freed prisoners move through a command node their kind had never been allowed to see. Bronn sat near him, working grease into the joint of his Netherium arm, where the bolt scoring had stiffened it. "You're going to win this," Varuna said. It wasn't a question. "I've been here long enough to know the difference between a riot and a war, and this is the second one." The water shifted slow behind the cracked faceplate. "I didn't think I'd see it. I stopped thinking I'd see anything but that ceiling." He was quiet a moment. "I had a sea once, a whole sea. They took me off a transport, like the one that brought you, and I never saw open water again. This suit's the most of it I've had in." He made the bubbling sound that passed for a laugh. "I stopped counting. I told you that. I really did stop counting." "You'll see water again," Bran said. "Maybe." Varuna didn't sound like he believed it, but he didn't sound bitter either. He sounded like something very old and very tired that had found at the end one thing worth being awake for. "Doesn't matter much. I got to watch them bleed. I got to help. That's more than I'd asked the universe for in a long time." He lifted one heavy forelimb and looked at it. Funny what's enough when you've had nothing for long enough. Across the node, Hask was doing something quieter and stranger. The laborer had found one of the soft-shelled prisoners' young, a small one, separated in the chaos, frightened of every shape in the room, including the enormous six-limbed thing that approached it. Hask sat down a careful distance away. He didn't reach for it. He just lowered himself until he was smaller than it, somehow, all 6 limbs tucked, and he made a low rumbling sound in his chest, the same sound over and over, until the small one stopped shaking. Then he nudged a ration block across the floor to it with one limb and looked away, as though giving it privacy to decide whether to trust him. Varuna watched him for a long moment. 40 years he hauled whatever they put in front of him, the old aquatic said quietly. That's all the Saurik ever saw when they looked at him. The strongest, back on the floor. He made the soft, bubbling sound that passed for a sigh. They never thought to ask what else he might be. Marshall watched Hask waiting patiently for the frightened child to choose. They wrote down the wrong thing about all of them, he said. The relay node settled into the uneasy quiet that followed the fighting. Around them, freed prisoners carried the wounded, gathered weapons, and secured the last corners of the command post, while Jace kept working. The seams continued to unfold across his slate, the path to the forge controls resolving out of the dark. By the time the relay node was fully secured, the way forward had opened. Jace laid it out on the slate for all of them. The seam they'd ridden up, the border where Korath and Sethric were still burning each other's sectors, and beyond it, past one more stretch of unguarded maintenance dark, 2 objectives sitting almost side by side. The forge controls, where the molten Netherium of the whole facility was steered and poured, and past those, behind the heaviest doors left in the prison, the command bunker. Duke Valis. The houses are still shooting at each other, Jace said. Baron Korath thinks Sethric robbed him. Sethric thinks Korath's making a play for his research. Neither one's looking down anymore. They're looking at each other. That's our window, and it's open right now. He looked up, but it won't stay open. The second Valis forces them back in line. That seam closes, and we're back to throwing bodies at a kill box. Then we don't wait for him to do that. Marshall looked at the 2 objectives on the slate, the forge, the bunker, side by side, the whole back half of the story sitting one dark corridor away. We take the forge controls. We turn their own pour on their own command, and we end this before the Duke gets his houses pointing the right direction again. And Valis? Collins asked. Marshall looked at the bunker on the slate, at the heavy doors, at the one Saurik who hadn't panicked in any of this. Valis is behind the last door in the place, he said, so we go through everything else first, and then we go through him. None of them knew that 2 levels up, in the quiet of his command, the Duke had already fueled a courier and begun loading the one thing worth carrying off a dying world, and that the last door in the prison was a door he had no intention of being behind when they reached it. The forge controls sat behind a blast door that had never been built to keep prisoners out, because no one who designed Kairos 9 had ever imagined prisoners getting this far. It had been built to keep the houses out of each other's work. The forge sector answered only to its own walled system, and its master had already pulled half his guards to go shoot at Korath over a supply train that had never been stolen. What remained was a skeleton crew, and the rebels came up through the maintenance dark and hit it with everything the lower armory had given them. It was still a fight. The Saurik, holding the control room, were technicians with weapons, not soldiers, but a technician with a wall at his back and a crew-served gun fires it just as hard, and the approach was a narrow gallery with no cover, and the rebels paid the toll going in. Hask paid the most of it. The laborer went first through the gallery, the way he always went first, 6 limbs and a torn sheet of armory plating held up in front of him like a shield, drawing the gun so the prisoners behind him could close. The plating held for most of the gallery. It didn't hold all of it. A sustained burst found the seam where two of his limbs met his body and went through, and Hask went down hard in the middle of the open gallery, with the gun still tracking him, and for a moment it looked like the end of him. Varuna walked out into the fire and stood over him. The old aquatic put his own enormous body between the gun and the fallen laborer, and let the burst hammer into the tank suit, starring it, cracking it further. While every eye stayed on the giant, Bronn exploded out of the smoke. The Netherium leg hit the deck like a piston, launching him the length of the gallery, before the technicians realized the giant wasn't the real threat. The black hand caught the crew-served weapon as it swung toward him, tore it free from its mount, and drove it through the firing position like a battering ram. By the time Marshall and Collins reached the position, there was nothing left to clear. Hask was alive, badly, 2 limbs ruined, bleeding into the gallery floor, but alive and conscious and swearing in his own language, and Varuna was helping drag him back with the others, his suit hissing now from a dozen small breaches it hadn't had that morning. "Stay down," Bran told Hask, crouching over him, jamming a field seal into the worst of the wounds. "You're done. You held the door. That's enough. I can still." Hask tried to get a limb under himself. "You can't. And you don't have to." Bronn pressed him flat. "You did your part. Let us do the rest." The control room was theirs. Bran stood up in the middle of it and looked at the forge laid out below the gallery glass, the crucible, the channels, the heavy manual sluices, the molten heart of Kairos 9. Then he looked at the schematic on the wall and traced one of the armored casting channels that ran toward the command levels. The command bunker sat at the end of it, built to receive molten Netherium from the forge whenever the upper foundries called for a pour. He began to understand exactly what the controls in his hands could do. The plan was simple. Carrying it out would cost them. The bunker assault was the worst fighting of the whole rebellion, because it was the only fighting the Sarek had truly prepared for. Everything below had been improvisation, guards meant for stock, suddenly facing a war. But the command levels were built to be held. The rebels threw themselves at it sector by sector, and the command levels made them bleed for every meter. And the house war that had cracked the prison open began, at last, to close. And it closed badly for the 2 who had started it. Sethric died alone, which was the only way a creature like Sethric could have died. When the rebels broke into his research sector, he called for reinforcements over his own walled network. No other house heard him. Koreth's forces, only 2 corridors away, never got the call, and would not have answered it if they had. Sethric had spent years making sure no one else could reach his work. In the end, no one could reach him. With Sethric's sector collapsing, the Baron saw, even now, even with the prison burning down around all of them, an opening. Sethric's research was unguarded. The discoveries Sethric had hoarded for weeks were sitting there for the taking, and the prestige of presenting them to the Duke, of finally having the thing his rival had denied him, was worth more to Koreth than the wall he was supposed to be holding. He pulled his own troops off the command-level defense to seize a dead rival's prizes, and the rebels drove straight through the gap he left behind. Baron Koreth died in Sethric's research bay, reaching for a slate full of data he'd wanted his whole career, while the rebellion poured through the breach his ambition had opened. The 2 of them ended a few meters apart, secrecy and ambition, both undone by the exact thing that had defined them. The last Sarek defensive line gave way, and the command bunker lay at the end of one final corridor. 2 levels above, in the forge controls, Bran watched the channel on his schematic clear all the way to Valis' seat. "We're through," Marshall's voice came up over the scavenged Sarek comms, ragged, close. "Bunker's 1 corridor out. Whatever you're doing up there, Bran, do it now, before they plug this hole." Bran put his black hand on the heavy manual sluice. He didn't rush. The Sarek had spent centuries measuring strength, endurance, and compatibility. but they'd never understood the thing that mattered most. A human with his hands on a machine slows down at exactly the moment everything tells him to hurry. Bran read the pour one last time. The crucible was full. The channel was clear, running straight to the command bunker, where Duke Zoran Valis had ruled Kairos 9 for 40 years, and where the orders had come from that put a pregnant female on a table, 3 children behind a bright door, and untested Netherium into Bran's own body to see if it would kill him. The forge had been built to make weapons out of prisoners. He was about to make a weapon out of the forge. Bran. Varuna's voice behind him, bubbling and slow. The old aquatic had come up to the control room, his cracked suit hissing, and he was looking through the gallery glass at something the cameras showed. Sarek soldiers. A counterattack. Moving up the maintenance seam the rebels had climbed, coming to retake the controls before the pour could happen. A dozen of them. They're coming fast. They're going to reach you before you can open it. Somebody has to hold the gallery. Varuna, I told you about my sea. The water shifted behind the ruined faceplate. Calm. Settled. I stopped counting the years after they took it from me. One heavy forelimb lifted, almost gentle, and pushed Bran back toward the sluice. Pour your metal, mechanic. I'll get you the time. He went out into the gallery alone. The Sarek counterattack came up the seam and found the old aquatic waiting in the narrow mouth of it, too big to flank, too slow to ever retreat, and it did not matter that his suit was failing because he had no intention of using it again after this. He met them in the gallery. He filled it. The breaches in his tank suit wept and then poured, and the air that was killing him was an air he had stopped needing to care about. And he held the only door that mattered with the patience of a creature that had waited longer than the 4 pirates had been alive for exactly this. For one moment, where his size and his hate and his long endurance were finally, completely enough. Behind him, Bran opened the sluice all the way. The channel took the molten Netherium and ran it bright and white-orange toward the command levels, the same alloy the Sarek had poured into 100 species to see which would survive it. This time, it poured into the heart of Sarek Command. The fortress, 40 years of rule. The forge took all of it, the way it had been quietly taking prisoners for centuries. Except this time, it took the ones who'd been doing the pouring. The bunker did not survive it. In the gallery, the last of Varuna's water ran out onto the floor, and the old aquatic who had bought the moment did not see it land. But he'd seen the metal move. He'd seen it go. That was the thing he'd asked the universe for, and at the very end, the universe had not been able to find a reason to refuse him. For a moment, nobody on Kairos 9 did anything at all. The alarms had stopped. There was nothing left in the command levels to sound them. The fighting had stopped because the thing the Sarek had been defending was gone, and a soldier with nothing behind him to protect is just a creature deciding whether to live. Across the lower prison and up through the broken sectors, the rebellion stood still and listened to a silence none of them had ever heard in this place, the silence of a machine that had finally stopped running. They had done it. The prisoners of Kairos 9 had taken Kairos 9. In the control room, Marshall came up through the wreckage and found Bran still standing at the sluice with his hands resting on the lever. The two of them looked at each other and didn't say anything because there wasn't a word built for it. Across the prison, the freed prisoners came out into the open halls. Some wept. Others simply stood, learning the shape of a thing they had stopped letting themselves want. Even the old 4-armed prisoner who had refused to rise stepped out at last, his young beside him, and looked around without fear for the first time. They'd won. For one quiet minute, they let themselves feel it. Then Jace came up from the lower command relay with a slate in his hand, and his face wrong. "The bunker's empty," he said. "I pulled the internal feeds before the pour hit. Valis wasn't there. He left an hour ago." He turned the slate so Marshall could see. An empty docking bay. Open bay. Doors. The Duke had a ship waiting while the houses were still shooting at each other. Jace's jaw tightened. I traced the archive transfer. He got the research core, the human compatibility data, the Nitherium results, the facility list. Marshall looked from the empty docking bay to the channel of cooling alloy that had poured into a bunker the Duke had already abandoned. He let us take it, he said quietly. The prison was already lost. The only thing he ever meant to save was the research. Collins looked at him. We won. It wasn't quite a question. We won here, Marshall said. He looked toward the upper docks, toward the dark the courier had vanished into. He never meant Kairos 9 to be the only one. The 9th came down out of that same dark 11 hours later and found a war already over. General William Joseph had brought a fleet expecting to fight through orbital defenses and storm a fortress. And the orbital defenses were dead, and the fortress was a smoking ruin held by a few thousand freed prisoners of 40 different species and 4 humans who looked like they hadn't slept in a week. The Marines came down hard and ready. They found Kairos 9 already taken. It was Hask who met the first of them. The laborer had refused to be carried. He stood on the limbs he had left, leaning on a Sorek rifle he used as a crutch at the mouth of the main landing bay when the Marines came through in full kit, weapons up, expecting the enemy. He looked at them out of a face built nothing like theirs, and said, in the broken Terran the translator gave him, the only thing that needed saying. You're late. A wet, broken, 6-limbed breath. We already won. Joseph found the 4 of them in the captured command relay an hour later. He was a big man and a tired one, and he stood in the wreckage of a place his intelligence had told him almost nothing about. Looking at 4 pirates, he'd scrambled a fleet to chase over 16 stolen crates. The math was plainly not the math he'd flown in expecting. Marshall. He'd read the file on the way in. Captain Rourke Marshall, you're under arrest. You and your crew. The processors, the smuggling, the deaths that came with it. That hasn't changed. Didn't think it had, Marshall said. Joseph looked around the relay, at the cooling alloy, the freed prisoners, the scale of what 4 criminals had pulled down from the inside. I came here to rescue you. Instead, I found you holding the place. We did. I want to know what they were doing here. Joseph's eyes went to Brand's black arm, then lower, to the alloy leg braced beneath him. Marshall gave Jace a slight nod. Jace stepped forward with the slate. Before this place fell, I pulled their archive. Project Ascension. Centuries of research. Every facility tied to it. Kairos 9 is only one entry on the list. He let that settle. Human compatibility data. Nitherium research. The Duke who walked out of here carrying his own copy of it. Everything the Directorate is going to need when the Sarek come looking for humanity. Joseph was quiet for a moment. You're offering to deal. We're pirates, Marshall said. We don't beg. We deal. He stood, slow and tired, until he was level with the general. We're not asking for a pardon. We did what we did, and we'll answer for it. But when you go after the rest of Project Ascension, you're going to want the only 4 people who've ever torn one apart from the inside. Joseph looked at the slate, then at the prison. Then, longest of all, at Hask, leaning in the doorway, and the thousands of freed prisoners filling halls that had been grinding sentience to nothing for centuries. No pardon, he said at last. You serve. You're watched. You earn every inch of it. The first time you run, the deal's done. He held out his hand. But you'll finish what you started here. Marshall looked at his crew. Bran, the enemy's alloy still bonded to his body. Collins, who had turned prisoners into an army. Jace, whose stolen archive had just bought them all another chance. Hask in the doorway, the empty place where Varuna should have been. One by one, they met Marshall's eyes and gave the smallest of nods. That's a sentence, Marshall said. It's a sentence, Joseph agreed. Then we'll serve it. A soft chime sounded in Joseph's earpiece. He lifted a hand. Joseph. Sir. Carter's voice came back over the secure channel. I've shadowed the courier through its jump. Report. The vessel bearing Duke Zoran Valis' personal crest completed a single jump to Vascor, a private house Valis holding. I've maintained a safe distance under cloak, transmitting coordinates now. Coordinates received, Joseph said. Joseph looked at the crew, then at Marshall. Looks like your sentence starts today.
Hey there, space human. I'm really curious about your thoughts on this video. Drop a quick comment and let me know what's on your mind. Or just say hi if you prefer. Either way, I'd love to hear from you. Also, remember to check the pinned comment. Trust me, it's worth a look. Oh, and one last thing. I've chosen another video for you to watch. Just click the card here. Or here if you want the whole playlist. See you there.